Thank you very much. 1 second, let me erase that. So when we were approached to do the Galileo exhibit and we decided to go ahead and take part in this wonderful, expansive program that's taking our campus by storm, we were extremely excited. Admittedly, when we first started, my career is, I'm an entomologist. I study bugs. And so when we were approached to do Galileo, my first thought initially was, I really don't know anything about astronomy. This is going to be interesting. And it did seem a little bit initially disparate between, again, a natural history museum and doing Galileo, who's primarily known for astronomy. I also was fairly naive. Again, most of us, when you hear the name Galileo, you think of, again, the sun being inside of the earth and that the Pope really didn't like him. But again, we were sort of naive about how Galileo's world initially could be tied in with our museum. But once we dove into it and engaged more with Carrie in the Department of History of Science, we actually found a wealth of connections and information about that world and also Galileo and natural history, which is what I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to structure my talk in this manner. The first will be a brief introduction to Galileo's world. Carrie did a great job already touching on this. The Society of the Lynx, which is actually our primary connection to Galileo. I'll dive a little bit more into that. And as he has also mentioned, our primary focus right now, which is the Hernandez volume. In January, we'll actually be phasing that out and switching to the apiarium, which he also had mentioned, and focusing on microscopy. But for time's sake, I'm going to focus today on the Hernandez volume. There's also what was interesting as we were going through this, creating this exhibit, about when we were learning a little bit more about the struggles of the Society of the Lynx and the scientists of the time getting this massive publication published. It reminded us a lot of what it took for our community to get our museum built. As you remember, it was built in 2001, and our collections were in an interesting situation at that point. So I'll touch a little bit on that, about the shared struggles that we have had that was similar to what they had in the time, getting their knowledge out there. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about our shared mission. Again, all of us here, those who study astronomy, meteorology, all the different sciences, and not even sciences, arts, music, all of us are joined by a shared mission to explore the world around us. For those of us in science, it's a little bit more targeted, but we all share this philosophy. And again, philosophy of science, and for us at the museum, understand the world's diversity, and also inspiring future generations. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the reason Galileo is so important is because he inspired us. He inspired us that there's enough information that we could create an entire exhibit across campus just based on him and his world. Again, Carrie went ahead and touched on this. So the project is across several different institutions, campuses and institutions, Italy and here. It really shows just how immense our collection here is at the History of Science department. I mean, so many volumes, it's amazing. And it really, when you see that we're only showing a fraction of it, it's amazing not only to look at that, but also to conceive of what they also must have in that vault that we're not able to see. So, and I've been in there, it's really kind of like a tank, so the books are protected. Okay, so I'm going to touch a little bit about the Society of the Lynx. So this was one of the first historical societies that we have a record of. It was established in 1603 by Fernando Sessi, Federico Sessi. And it was formed with 3 of his friends. When he formed the society, he was only 18 years old. So he was already dabbling into science at a fairly young age. And he was actually inspired by Galileo and a lot of the different scientists at the time that were starting to get all this information from the world around them. And it was just creating so many new ideas that they didn't really have the concept to sort of fit it in. And so when he created the society, he wanted to go ahead and study science in all forms. He and his three friends were initially also excited about the fact that as they were learning more about the world around them, they also were finding out that the world that they thought they knew was actually much more intriguing than what they initially thought. For example, Ceci in Italy lived near a lot of these funerals, which are actually sort of gaseous excretions from volcanic matter. And he was finding all of these trees, these fossilized trees. And, for a lot of the people at the time, things were considered fairly static, and yet you had these fossils of things that existed now, but they are clearly not living trees. And so he was already sort of questioning, okay, we have these things that we know we have trees, but we're having these fossilized trees. Where do fossils sort of fit in with all of this? So he and his friends, even just exploring their backyards, just were discovering things that a lot of other scientists at the time or even before them really didn't know how to conceive. And so on top of it, they also were starting to question the world around them in the sense that what they thought they knew about science and natural history was starting to get a little bit more dicey as they started to get all this information in from the New World, which we'll touch on in a minute with the Hernandez volume. I do want to mention, though, how does Galileo fit in with this, with the Society of the Links? I sort of skipped a little bit. Galileo was actually brought into the Society of the Links in 1611. He was joined by several other members that came in and out of the society, and throughout their work, the members not only were working on some of their own research projects, but a lot of it was actually to go ahead and help Galileo publish several of his works. And so they actually were sort of, if you can imagine, sort of cheerleaders for him and helping him get some of his most valuable and well-known publications out. So one of these, for example, was the sunspots. So they were not only trying to work with Galileo, but also to promote him and help him, because they were so inspired by his vision of science that they took his new work and also all these other new works and really made an effort to try and get it out there to the rest of the world. They thought it was so inspiring that it had to be shared. And so that was a major focus for them. The Mexican Treasury, which is the Hernandez volume, is actually one of those volumes that they took on, especially Ceci, who is the leader of the group. They took on and were just inspired, but I don't think they later realized when they took this on, it was quite a challenge that Ceci actually couldn't even complete because he died before it was finished. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Oh yeah, and then there's the telescope. So, quick note about Hernandez. So, Francisco Hernandez was a physician of King Philip II of Spain, and he was sent to Mexico with his son to go learn about Central American biology and primarily to learn about medicines. So King Philip wanted to send him over there to find out more about if there's anything that could be used in Spain, whether for medicine or for economic reasons. So he was there for quite a long period of time. As a doctor, he was actually one of the first people to see hemorrhagic fever in Mexico and document it in a clinical manner. And on top of it, they hired two native artists, to actually document what they saw, which, when you think about it, is actually pretty new for the time, because not only did they trust these people to do very accurate depictions, but also that when they were writing the names, which actually Hernandez, this volume here, is really unique in that it kept Aztec names for a lot of these animals and plants, that they were going to be authentic. And so they hired these artists. They actually baptized them and brought them in to all their projects across different parts of Mexico. But they created these massive wealths of manuscripts of color illustrations of all kinds of crazy things for them at the time. For example, here's a picture of a armadillo. You can imagine if you're from Europe You maybe, if you're very, very rich and had a friend who was a really good collector, maybe saw a rhinoceros, maybe. What would you think if you saw this thing? I mean, it's fluffy, it's got a shell, it looks like a bit like a pig in here. So first of all, when they're doing these first encounters with these things, they're like probably very confused. And then if it didn't fit one of their categories of what they knew about animals at the time, they probably, well, we know that they ended up keeping a lot of the Aztec names because they're like, I don't know. Well, they call it this. I guess we're going to call it this too because I have no clue what it is. So if you go through the Hernandez volume, you could see where Ceci, when he was going through some of these copies, was just either sort of, bewildered, but also on top of it inspired. Here's this amazing wealth of material that this gentleman had been working on for 7 years. This has to get out there. So again, Federico Ceci, who is one of the founding members, he actually got an opportunity to go see, so when the book came over here from Mexico, King Philip was sort of frustrated the fact it took so long to get there, and then later sent it to the Library of Escorial, where he asked one of his friends, I think it was Recchi, to go ahead and, Antonio Recchi, to go ahead and annotate it and make it readable, because it was these massive, massive boxes of wealth. It was about 24 books, 11 volumes of color illustrations, and over 4,000 illustrations. So I want you guys to think about that for a second. This is before computers. This is before even pencils were regularly available. Paper. I mean, paper was not exactly easy to get. You couldn't go to Staples. So he had these artists go out there and paint 4,000 illustrations with color. Also, pigments were not exactly easy to come by, and bring them back to Spain. That is an immense amount of work. And so when Ceci saw this material, again, Recchi was the original, and he had to go through all of it and try and make it somehow, fluid and also coherent. As he did this, Ceci actually got an opportunity later to see that annotated volume, and what was interesting, well, actually kind of sad, is the originals ended up getting burned at Escorial later. So I don't think we'll ever be able to see those original 4,000. But he did see the copies. A lot of them were actually very well done and some of the best copies of the originals. And here's an example here of some of the plants that Ceci had copied from those copies of some of the new types of plants that they saw in Mexico. So yuccas, all kinds of interesting flowers. So again, there was this massive volume that Ceci had and the other members of the Links had decided that it had to be published. It had to be put out there. There was so much information, and it became essentially the life's work of Ceci and became one of the central points. And when it actually got published, it was published about 60 years after the original pages got here. Well, not here, but Spain and Italy. So it took a lot of work and different circumstances for that to actually come into fruition. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this came about and how we ended up having this incredible volume still that is impressive even today, 60 years later. We're also going to take this opportunity to go ahead and tie so Ceci's passion for this manuscript and getting this out there, as well as several of Galileo's works, to our mission at the museum. So Galileo's passion, as well as Ceci's, and scientists at that age, are a lot like us in that, again, as Carrie pointed out, they're modern men. They're people that saw the world around them and wanted to know more. They saw objects, they saw stars, and they were inspired. And that inspiration is one thing to have it for yourself, but it's another thing to be inspired enough to try and pass it on to others. It's that wonderment of knowledge. And so here at the museum, our goal is that same mission. We are scientists who every day walk into work and are inspired by either the objects we have behind the scenes, the world that's outside of us, even in the field behind us, in our prairie. We are inspired by Oklahoma. We are inspired by the natural world, and we're all those same people. We are ones who want to share that inspiration. And so when we had the opportunity in 2001 to build this new facility, how many of you guys have actually been there? Hopefully all you guys have been there. Yeah, it's really nice. We'll talk a little bit about that. That was only recently built in 2001. So we're going to talk a little bit how that came into being and protecting our objects, much like how Ceci's volume of the Hernandez came into being. Again, as I touched on, all of us have a humble beginning in that we want to learn more about the world around us. This is the case for Hernandez. He was sent on a mission to go to Mexico, not so much maybe it was partly his choice, but his mission there was to learn about the world around him. And for us, our initial foundations were the same, to learn about Oklahoma. We were established in 1899, so before actually Oklahoma was a state. And one of our primary missions was to learn as much as we could about the state as possible. And so, for example, in this picture, this is some of the paleontological finds that we had, primarily by our former director at the time. I think Stovall was director at the time. But our primary mission is to understand Oklahoma and bring that knowledge into the public. However, great visions for things like the Hernandez volume in our museum also come with great risk. When you have great vision, you have to understand that you're also going to take a large leap of faith in getting that accomplished. In the case of the Hernandez volume, it was just the sheer volume of that text, on top of the fact that publishing was not exactly an easy thing to do at the time, and it also was not exactly the best environment at the time to do science. We'll touch on this a little bit more in a minute. For us, the great vision came with the fact that financially it was not a very good period to try and get our collections moved into a space like the museum. Until then, all of our collections were actually thrown across different parts of campus. So I believe, for example, my department, recent invertebrates, was stuck above a chemistry attic. I know there was, I think, archaeology was in a football stadium basement. So we were scattered throughout campus in different locations, and partly was because there was no money or anywhere else to put it. So we had this massive amount of Oklahoma history just being stored in random places all throughout campus, and no way at the time financially to unify them into one museum. We did have a little bit of a space, an exhibit space, which is the Stovall building. You could still see them in campus, but no real unified structure to protect and show our gems, our Oklahoma gems. And so these two things, again, really need these two people, in this case for us, the museum, Dr. Mars, in this case, Federico Ceci, these leaders really took on a big risk getting these things accomplished. As I had mentioned, publication at the time was not exactly easy. You didn't have computers. You didn't really have, everything was either handwritten, or if you were lucky, you had a printing press. At this time, the printing press was becoming more available to publish books. But if you wanted a picture, what do you do now? You take your camera, take a picture, you Instagram it, hashtag love it, or you Photoshop, or you have a nice, possibly if you're a good drawer or illustrator, you could draw something. But back then, everything had to be hand-drawn. And a lot of it you also had to have, you had a description, maybe. So for example, what would you put for an armadillo? Shell thing with fur. Okay, how do you draw that? You might have a specimen, part of a specimen to be kind of a reference at the time, but this is a continual problem for them, especially the plants. Some of it they actually had plants that they could press and copy from, but copying and then copies of copies, every time you go through and you copy something, it's a little bit different. So how close to the original is it? And there were 4,000 illustrations. So on top of that, people were passing away as it was getting published. 60 years is a long time. Again, Ceci had passed away by the time it was finished. So there were all these different hurdles that had to happen between this book getting published and, again, it being revealed to the rest of the world. For us, in our collection, it was actually the fact that everything was stored in chemistry buildings and actually huge fire hazards. There were some areas where actually to walk into the space, if there was a fire, there was no way you'd be able to get out in time before you burned to death. So the fire department really didn't like us very much at that point either. So Dr. Mars saw this, and he saw the fact that these were all over the place in all these different horrible conditions and decided that this can't happen. This is not accessible for Oklahomans. This is not accessible for researchers and future Oklahomans. How can we protect these and make them available for future generations if we can't take care of them now? So, again, not only were Ceci and Galileo visionaries, but we also saw quickly that our director was a visionary in this sense, in that he provided this venue for this show, but also created the museum itself for us to be able to do this. Some of the wonderful things about our museum, too, is it allows us to take advantage of these connections and be able to show them and bring it to the campus. And that's part of our mission as well, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Sort of following in on that, the next sort of topic I want to touch on is revival, because we wanted to make all of these specimens and also this exhibit accessible to future generations. And everything that we have in our collection, a lot of it's already knowledgeable within the scientific community, but it was harder to kind of get that out there to the public. So how do we convince the public that the knowledge that we have is actually usable by them and something that will inspire them? Well, we need to raise the funds to be able to get that information out there. So for us, it was raising capital for the museum. And for Hernandez to be able to publish his book, he also kind of ran into similar problems. So if you were a man of Galileo's time, the only way that you would get something like this published was if you had a lot of money, and in this case, Ceci was actually an aristocracy, or you probably had to go to the church or some of the rich families. So in this case, for a lot of the bigger projects, it had to be either tied in with, again, the church or even possibly the Pope. So you don't really do that today. I doubt you could go to the Pope right now and ask for sponsoring some publications, but at the time, that's one of the major groups of funding was actually the church. Now, not so much. As I mentioned, Ceci was a nobleman. His dad actually was not a huge fan of the fact that he was doing so much with science. In several of the texts that we read about Ceci and the Society of the Links, his dad actually intentionally tried to create a problem with him with his publications, including getting one of the members of his first four thrown into jail as a heretic. So thanks, Dad. Maffeo Barberini, whose crest is shown here with the 3 Bs. This will be a topic we discuss a bit more in the apiarium in the second half of our exhibit. He also was a friend and also a patron of the society. If you go through a lot of the books up in our show, you'll actually see references to bees. This wasn't by chance because they loved bees. I wish they did as much as I do, but no, it's because they were referencing Pope Urban the 8th, and also the fact that he was a major patron at the time. In our case, so we can't exactly go to the Pope for money. It's not really appropriate for today. We actually went to the community. And again, this comes down to inspiration and coming up with new connections, because we actually, as a community in Norman, helped raise the money to get this museum built. So we raised about $5 million. This was through a tax that we voluntarily put on ourselves to get this museum built. And then we also had a donation from the Noble family to get for about $15 million. And then the state helped finish it off once they realized that we are serious about this. And this was something that we thought, and the community thought, is important for Oklahoma. So again, our museum not only was creating connections with scientists, but also our community. Our community realized that science is important, that this museum is important. These artifacts are important for you and future generations. And so, much like Ceci recognized, this book was important. It's important for future generations. It is worth the effort. And also, so Ceci getting this book published was his way of disseminating the science. Science, as we know today, is very different than what it was back then. I bet if you go around here and I ask you guys what is science, you'll probably say it as you definitely would have a connotation of science is exploration, or science is a guy in a white lab coat. We have a very defined term of what science is. And we have, as those of us as scientists, have a very defined scientific process. It is observation, hypothesis, testing, results, conclusions. That's what it is. Back then, if you're a scientist, you dabbled in pretty much everything. There was no strict science. That's why we're partially able to do such an amazing exhibit that we have today, because it connects with all kinds of things that we traditionally would not consider science. Music, art. So because of this, it wasn't an official term. Disseminating it really wasn't something that they were able to do at the time, because there was no definition of it. Further, when you disseminated science, it only went to a few groups of people. So imagine back then the fact that of the people who can do science, it's usually wealthy noblemen, doctors, maybe some of the clergy, again, Jesuits, but there's only a few people that, even when you publish this manuscript, they would be the ones reading, because a lot of them didn't have money for books. And if they had money, it was not likely they'd be teaching a whole lot of people, the lay person, necessarily what's inside of it. So those dissemination was fairly limited. That's not a problem we have today, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But only a few people could actually read, and those who could read were often noblemen, and the rest of the people probably couldn't read. Science, they probably, or we would consider science, they learned from their families, working in a garden, going outside. But what they were actually learning most about was through pictures, so things like stained glass windows, and usually it's biblical. This started to change a bit, again, when the printing press came out, but back then, again, it was fairly limited what you could do with science and disseminating it. That is not the case today. Even though science is a lot more defined than it used to be, ease of dissemination is not a problem at all. And we have structures like the museum that we could bring in people and engage them in science. Literacy is is pretty much not a problem today. Everybody can read, for the most part. Almost everybody has been to school and has learned some degree of a science background. So dissemination isn't a problem as much as engagement. And this is what this show does a great job of. I think that the History of Science has done a great job, and we had hopefully done the same with our component of the show, of engaging the public. Anybody can pick a book out these days. Books are even considered frivolous, but not everybody can engage these books like I think that these exhibits can, because they're inspirational, especially as he had mentioned, when all the work that goes into them, you see how much work there is. And on top of it, we want to also promote one of the things that Ceci not only did with this book and showed how much work Hernandez did, but also we want to show what current work and current things that scientists are doing so we can engage the public in current research as well. So we wanted to tie in our exhibit, and I hope you guys get a chance to see it, not only how these ancient scientists of Galileo's time were engaging, at this time mostly their peers, but in future generations had inspired them in ways they never knew, but also how we're trying to continue this ourselves as current scientists, and also how we do it with our own research. So again, tying this back in, we have the same drive. We both, myself, Dr. Maras, all of us at the museum have the same drive that we want to reveal their secrets. That's why we have PhDs in science, is because we just love it so much. But again, part of this is also this perception of worldviews, that by learning the world around you, we have a better understanding of ourselves. And again, this is something that they understood at the time too, or at least they're starting to grasp. By not only looking inward and looking at historical contemporaries, and also looking at historians of the past, but if you looked to the future and you looked at the world around you, not only learned more about yourself, but you also learned more about the world, well, starting to question a bit about the world around you. And this is something that humans have always had. Again, bringing it to the modern today, we've always been curious about the world around us. And again, we build this on our own personal experience and those we learn from experts. So in the case of the Society of the Lynx, they actually, a lot of them would have to have read most of the classics at the time and really had focused on earlier philosophers to base their conceptions of the world around them. This is Aristotle, who is one of the most famous and one of the ones that they focus a lot on, and he was actually one of the primary bases for studying, again, how life was organized, and also, again, just worldviews. So they were looking back more towards Greeks and some of the earlier philosophers to understand their world, but at this period now, they're starting to also question that by looking forward and seeing all this new material that they couldn't quite fit into these old paradigms. So again, as sort of touching on that again, as they're looking back in classic literature and philosophy, they're starting to take these philosophies and trying to project them onto all these weird things that they were starting to see in the Hernandez volume, and it just wasn't fitting or matching up. For example, in our exhibit, we have a narwhal tusk. You can imagine how weirded out they were by this. Unicorn in the water. Or the armadillo, that's actually what one looks like. So these odd animals and plants that started to make them wonder, okay, well, Aristotle had this way of organizing life. These don't fit. What does that mean? This is not, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for the future? What does this mean for science? And also at the time, they also had a very progressive view of animals and life, where you definitely had levels of complexity. So humans are always at the top, but it was very basic, and things slowly drove up to humans in these very defined categories. And so in Aristotle's case, he actually had plants divided by size and structure, and in animals, he had them divided by where they lived. And so things that you would sort of consider odd now, we definitely don't categorize life by where they lived, or things that were stone-like were all kind of in one group, or non-animate were sort of grouped together. We now know that these things, they're very artificial constructions, but at the time, they really had nothing to reference. I mean, they had to go back to their ancestors, again, with Aristotle, but it was a whole new world for them. With these odd things that were starting to pop up. Again, this is a fungus that's, it looks like someone threw up, but, or fossilized trees. They just, they did the best they could. They didn't have computers. They didn't have books to reference pictures and and say, oh, I've seen that before. They did the best they could. And Ceci was one of those people that, when he was getting this wealth of information from Hernandez, was starting to realize, okay, we really need to change things, because this is not working for all this material we're seeing in this book. And that actually became one of his largest focuses in the manual, was not only publishing it, but also he was one of the first to try and classify everything as best as he could, considering what they had with all these images and what they knew before. So if you get a chance to look at the book and see that section, it's really impressive, because he tried really hard. And unfortunately, he passed away before he could finish. And he was both overwhelmed by this, but also inspired. Again, these are images from his own backyard. I mean, it's hard to be in the beautiful mountains of Italy and not be inspired. But that inspiration in particular, I want to focus on 3 scientists as well at the museum who focus on this sort of research that he was starting to dab into briefly. So to show this last sort of connection that we have with Ceci. So, as I mentioned, Ceci was actually trying to classify life as he knew it, and as well as trying to take into account all these new, wonderful, exotic things that he was seeing in these books and trying to make sense of it. It was probably like opening a Pandora's box, and that act of opening a box is what drives myself, as well as Dr. Mares and also Dr. Cameron Seiler, actually 4, Dr. Braun, all of us who have that, who do that type of research, which is called classification. For us, when we get a new box of specimens, you're both overwhelmed because, wow, this is a lot of different stuff, but it's also inspiring. Where do these things fit in the world? How are they related? And Ceci was the same way. And that's actually a main focus of us at the museum is actually, like I said, this act of classification. Dr. Mars and Dr. Braun had described this mouse here from Argentina. Dr. Seiler had described these lizards from the Philippines. And then I described this bug here from Australia. So we as scientists are like Ceci. We get this wealth of information, this wealth of diversity, and also continue to try and publish this stuff and get it out there so people like you can see it or other scientists can see it. That is our mission, much like Ceci's. Nowadays, we have a little bit easier. We have computers. Yay! Photoshop. Yay! It's easier to print. But we also use new techniques that Ceci didn't have at the time, like DNA. And we know that fossils aren't living organisms anymore. They used to be, but not anymore. So we don't really work with fossils as much as he was trying to figure out. We do have a really strong paleontology department. So sort of wrapping it up, kind of getting close on time. Classification that Ceci was trying to do with this book and all this stuff from Mexico is still an ongoing mission, and in fact, it's one of the strongest missions we have at the museum because every day we're still finding new stuff. You can imagine when Ceci, again, opened this trunk and he saw all of these pictures, and I bet 99% of it, well, actually, most of it was new. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. And you know what's really interesting is that is still the case even here in Oklahoma. Do you know how many new species we find in our backyards every year? Quite a lot, actually. I think it was 2 years ago we actually found a new type of bumblebee from Oklahoma that was found actually in a collection much like ours. And it's found in only one county in Oklahoma, brand new species. And I think it's actually named after the county. I'll have to double check on that. But every day, new species. When Ceci opened that trunk or saw all this material, most of it was large stuff. It's not likely today that we find too many new rhinoceroses, or we do find new monkeys. There was a new monkey discovered. Most of it now has shifted to things like my department, invertebrates, yay! That's the majority of things that we're finding that are new. But the process is still there, and we're still finding new things. And we love engaging the public to help us do so. And that's something that they didn't have at the time either in Galileo's period. Even though you had lots of laymen actually, wondering about the world and also probably discovering new species, they didn't have the ability to publish it and disseminate it like we do now. So we're actually working a lot more with the public and using your guys' knowledge as well to combine together to have a way to disseminate that to new generations. And so again, finally, our final mission, and this is again something that Galileo and the Society of Links was starting to tap into, because they are not only inspiring themselves, but inspiring others. The society grew over time, so they were bringing in new members and new ideas. So how do we do it today? How do we inspire others as we are inspired? So I want to go over a few things here. One of the things I want to point out, and this is really important, is this may seem really basic, but it's incredibly important. Galileo and his people were outside all the time. They're not closed in a cubicle every day. They are outside engaging the world. Whether they wanted to or not, I'm sure a lot of people really like to stay in a Hilton hotel versus living in a bedbug-infested mattress in Italy. But get outside and see the world around you. Galileo, Ceci, all of them were inspired by their backyards, staring at the sky, asking basic questions of the world around us by being in the world around us. Not enough people today are actually getting outside. There was a statistic that said a child these days, on average, knows over 100 corporate symbols, but knows less than 10 trees, names of trees. 10 trees. They can't name them. So to be the future generations of Galileo and Ceci, we need to be more outside. We also need to start engaging our youth. This exhibit, I think, is doing a great job with showing all the different ways that Galileo is impacting our lives so that we can engage youth. Well, why do you want to know science? It's something that's a part of our lives every day, and we try and engage youth to be able to show that to them. Again, literacy is much higher, so it's not that the information they can't get to them, it's a way of engaging them to actually listen to it. So we've started a lot of initiatives at the museum with our education program and also a lot of programming with this exhibit to engage the youth. We want future Cecis. We want future Galileos. Our focus is natural history, but that doesn't mean that they won't eventually move on to astronomy, meteorology, or any other fields, or geology. It's science itself. If you could get the science bug in their heads, it doesn't matter what kind of science it is. Or even if they move on to art, that inspiration will live with them forever. So, and lastly, working on why this is important is also a huge struggle for us and actually all sciences right now, is telling the community and the public why it's important. Why should we continue funding on science? Why should we keep doing a lot of these grand vision projects like going to Mars? In our case at the museum, again, our focus is on diversity and natural history. Why is this important? Why are my taxpayer dollars going to this? Well, it's important for ecosystems. It's important for our food supply. There are many practical reasons that we do the science that we do, not just because we're inspired, and honestly, it should be inspiring, but if you have to look at the practical reason, there are many important reasons. Very different. Some are the same as what they had in Galileo's time, but a lot of them are new ones that we're now addressing, such as invasive species. But again, it's important because we also need future generations to address these new discoveries and new things that we're discovering about the world around us. Again, invasive species or water pollution, things like that. And lastly, I sort of want to finish on this thought, finally wrapping things together. So again, when we had Galileo come to our museum, or the concept of doing a Galileo show, initially we were just daunted, and mainly because he was such an inspiration, not only to astronomy, but there's so much about him and that time that led us to where we are today. And there's always a quote that I remember my advisor told me when I was a PhD student. He said, "You stand on the shoulders of giants as you do science, because everything you do is built on findings or conclusions drawn by people before you." The problem is as you start to climb higher and higher and higher on all of these accomplishments, many of which were started by Galileo, Newton, Da Vinci, the higher you get, the vaster the horizon is once you're at the top. Because science, what's also the amazing thing about science is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And that's both daunting and also inspiring, because Ceci saw that, Galileo saw that, and now that we are now in the modern age, that we have all this research below us and we're standing at the very top of science, we realize there's still so much we don't know. And that's so cool. So anyways, there's so many people I'd like to thank. Dr. Carrie Magruder, Dr. Morris, who he's actually giving a presentation about our recent award over in Europe right now. Head of exhibits, Tom Luzitsky, he's amazing with what he's done with our exhibit space. James Burns, Melissa Rickman, Carolyn Scarce. I don't think I said her last name right. Sears. Anyways, an amazing team, and I'm really looking forward to working with them for the next half of our exhibit. And thank you guys so much. You guys should really go see the exhibit. It's fantastic. So, any questions?